Hello. Hi. Hey. Um, so this is performance improvements with Drupal 8 asset libraries. I'm Rikki Bochow. I'm a previous Next front-end developer. You can see me on Twitters and the Drupals on at Rikki_Icky. Asset library system has been a thing for a long time, more than just Drupal 8. Drupal 6, I think, was the first one it came into. So I knew it was a thing, but I never really looked into how it was meant to be used properly until recently. So sort of looking into it, realizing that there are a lot of benefits to it, but there were still other things that it impacted, like aggregation, that I didn't sort of realize straight away either. So, I mean, the whole journey challenged some of my assumptions and improved a lot of my understanding of the whole Drupal system, really. This sort of came out of a blog post I wrote back in August. Yeah, it's basically just an extension of that, really. I've learned a lot more since, so I wanted to expand on it, and I'll probably do another blog post after this. The blog post got a fair bit of sort of Twitter happiness, I guess. And Wim, one of the co-maintainers of the asset library system, said that this is how it was always meant to be used, which was really good to have that sort of feedback and to know that I was on the right track. So what's the goal? We're trying to improve performance, obviously, but there's other benefits like better Google rankings. Get a Google ranking, sorry. Google likes sites that load fast, and they'll index you better if you have a fast sort of, it's called a TTFB, or time to first byte. But also things just like making happier experience for your authors, reading things on mobile, having things load really fastly without using up a lot of their phone data and stuff like that. What we'll cover is sort of understanding the aggregation system, the asset library system itself, an implementation of this approach on our own previous Next site, and just testing the performance steps. I realized halfway through this talk that it was pretty sort of dry and there's no real jokes or anything, so this is Henry. He's my little gimmick to make everyone feel happy. So component-driven design, you've probably seen a couple of talks about this already. It's sort of the approach of developing modular namespaced UI components, things like atomic design, SMAX and BEM. I'm sort of hoping everyone's a bit familiar with this, but can I just get anyone that's not real? No, it looks like everyone's good. You can find me afterwards. I'm happy to rant on about this stuff. Concatenation is one of the things that sort of, one of the challenges that I had where it's something that we're always taught to do in the front end to improve performance, concatenate all of your files into one thing so that you're just making things faster generally. Build tools are usually involved in this, things like Grunt and Gulp and Webpack. There's a lot of other ones as well. Drupal aggregation does it itself anyway, so there's a lot of concatenation going on, really. So why do we do it? Essentially, it's to have less HTTP requests, so that everything loads quickly and it's cacheable. You've sort of got all of your assets for a site are on every page, and they're the same ideally on every page, and they go into the cache, and you don't have to reload anything. Is it still important when we've got things like HTTP2? Support for it is in all major browsers. 20% of websites roughly use HTTP2 now. What is it? HTTP2 is sort of a new protocol that creates a tunnel that a lot of connections can go through instead of each being its own connection. So it's really sped up how assets are loaded onto websites. Makes things like image sprites and concatenation in general less important. And I say less important, but they are still relevant, and I'll come back to that later. There's also a lot of unused CSS and JavaScript generally loaded on a page when everything's concatenated into one file. It's not uncommon to see sort of 70% of a CSS file isn't even used on a page, on any given page. Same for JavaScript, really. Things like visitors only seeing one page of the site. So if they've come to your site from a Google search result or a Twitter link, they're only looking at one page. They find the information, they leave, and then they leave. So they've downloaded all of the assets for the entire site looking at that one page, and they really didn't need to. It's also render blocking. So, I mean, nothing renders until the entire CSS file is finished downloading. So things like perceived performance are impacted by this. Minification is the other part. Sort of not all, I assume that all of Drupal core assets were being minified as part of aggregation, which isn't the case. JavaScript isn't minified in core, only the CSS is. Looking at the contrib ecosystem, there's a lot of modules that have JavaScript and CSS loading into your site that aren't minified. The advanced aggregation module, helps with this. It does go through and you can set it up to minify all of your core and module JavaScript and CSS, as well as your themes, JavaScript and CSS. But you can get more control by minifying your own assets as well in your theme and modules. You sort of have more control. Advanced aggregation can cause some problems I've seen with minifying stuff. Complex CSS, so like inline SVG stuff we've seen get a little bit mangled by advanced aggregation. So just having your own control is good as well, and also good with this particular approach, which I'll come back to. Is minification important? Yeah, it is. It decreases the file size drastically. Aggregation is the other big bit of this. It concatenates and minifies. I said exclamation mark is because it's not minifying JavaScript, but it does similar assets into smaller files. So it'll combine, ideally combine everything into one CSS file and one JavaScript file. It's provided by Drupal core, and it sort of does it on the fly. It saves files to disk. And I'll just go through that quickly. So you go to a page, the browser sort of checks the browser cache for a file. If the browser cache doesn't have it, then Drupal checks the disk for the aggregated file. If that file doesn't exist, they sort of have a unique hash name that they look for. If that file doesn't exist, it creates an aggregate file and saves it to the disk, and this takes time. Once the file exists, then the browser can download it and cache it. So you can see how sort of coming to a site, especially from a cold cache where everything's been cleared, can take a lot of time. And once that's all done, then the page will start rendering. So this article is about, says it's about Drupal 7, but it also covers how aggregation works in Drupal 8 as well, and what the differences are. Is aggregation important? If it combines sort of concatenation and minification, which is sort of, minification is important, but concatenation maybe less so, makes aggregation somewhat important, I guess. So I sort of started looking into this approach of thinking about these things as there's conditional assets and there's global assets. Global assets are loaded and ideally used on every page of your website, and conditional assets aren't. Modules are often conditional. They're sort of only load on a page. Their assets only load on a page when that module is needed or when a certain condition is met. So they're always generally conditional. And then in that case, sorry, themes are normally global in my experience anyway. So in the case where a module is conditional but still being aggregated, the aggregate file needs to be rebuilt on a page that has that module compared to a page that doesn't. So that sort of, the JavaScript file especially is generally rebuilt on a lot of different pages on your website, and until you, I mean, I didn't even realize this was happening until I started looking into this, but an example is the responsive image module. Any page that has a responsive image on it will have extra JavaScript inserted into that aggregate JavaScript file, which causes a new file to be rebuilt and re-downloaded, and compared to a page that doesn't have it. As I said, Henry, you're just giving me a break. This is what he would be doing if he was listening to me right now. So the asset library system. In Drupal 8, all asset files are added as libraries. There's no inline assets, inline JavaScript and CSS is not considered a library anymore. It's the same system for modules and themes, so it's worth noting that modules always load their libraries before a theme does, so that the theme can override any modules, basically. The docs for this got updated last Wednesday, which is really good because they were a little bit lacking before. I learnt a lot of this stuff just looking through the module code, which wasn't the greatest for a front-end developer. So what's the structure of the asset library system? It's got broken down into sort of things like SMAX categories. You've got file metadata. There's dependencies, licenses, and the docs cover all of this stuff now, but I'll just go through some examples. So this is an example of the SMAX structure. We've got CSS that can have broken up into a base, a layout, a component, state, and theme. And this essentially controls the order that they're being loaded into your site. Obviously, in this order, so base coming first, layout, and then sort of themes being the last one, so you can change sort of the colors of things on certain pages. It's an example of another sort of CSS stuff where you can have media query specific files if you want to, using these media screen, media print, media all is also an option. I generally don't do this approach. I usually have my media queries inside my files, but it's totally possible to do this. It's also an example of dependencies. You can list out sort of this header component can depend on the nav and the logo component of my theme, as well as any core libraries that I want to make it depend on, which basically ensures that it gets loaded together onto a page. JavaScript by default will load into the footer of your site unless you specify this header equals true on a library, and then it'll load into the head. You want to be careful with that because it is going to be even more render blocking than just your CSS if you have JavaScript loading in the head. But it's particularly useful for Modernizer because it is one of those libraries that needs to go up top. It's an example of, you've got the external type now, which isn't required if you've got this sort of // start on your file. The Drupal just knows that that's an external file. So you don't need to specify that. It's an example of the pre-process false flag, which is a big one in this approach, which basically is what disables aggregation on a library, or on a file, particular file of a library anyway. You can control the weight of things, so this is modernizer needs to be made sure it's up the top before any other JavaScript files, so they've pushed the weight up. And you can also say that it's been minified already, so that Drupal doesn't try and re-minify it. You've also got these attributes in JavaScript where you can say defer true or async true, and these just map into the standard JavaScript link attributes that you can use in HTML now. So they're really good, but they will force the pre-process to be false. So you technically don't need to say pre-process false, because adding attributes to any JavaScript file will disable the aggregation of that file. You can also show the license sort of information of a third-party library that you're adding. This is just an example from core. So you've got sort of the remote reference, the version, license details, which is just good for documentation, really. So let's just quickly go through attaching libraries. Like I said before, I sort of break this up into two ways. There's global and conditional. So the global is like you can do things like, so global, next slide, is basically anything added into your theme or modules.info.yaml file under this library's header. So you just list out any of your libraries here, and these are guaranteed to be loaded on every single page. Conditionally is generally for things like blocks, paragraphs, fields, a module, anything that is inserted as a module or pre-processed. So an example of pre-processing, you have this attached array. So you attach the library and then you reference the name of your library, and you can add that attached array to any render array in Drupal. So it doesn't have to be pre-processed, it can be any other kind of hook into a render array. You can also stick them straight into a Twig file. So this attach library function in Twig just lets you say that whenever this Twig file is loaded, this library also needs to be loaded. And then there's also this concept of overriding libraries. You can replace a module or a file or an entire library really using override. And it's a really good, I found it's a really good way to correct modules or core libraries where you want to have the control over its aggregation or not. So this top one's an example of replacing Modernizer with your own version of Modernizer. So that's targeting a very specific file within a core library. The next two are just disabling libraries entirely so that they're not being loaded at all. Or you can just replace an entire library with your own. So this is replacing core's responsive tables with my theme's responsive tables. And you can also extend libraries. So this last one will just add our library whenever that other library is being loaded, which I find really handy for fixing up overrides in the toolbar menu. So like I said, you can sort of use this library replacing thing to fix, so responsive tables has no preprocessed false flag on it, so it does cause a new aggregate file to be reloaded when it's used. By using my library, even if I'm just referencing the core library, I can still fix the aggregation issues that it causes. The differences from Drupal 7, group is predetermined. Group is sort of, the main two things were CSS and JavaScript, which is now written into the structure of of the library system. The every page flag is gone now. It's replaced by just having libraries referenced through an info file. Type is file by default or external, but not inline. And there's no more Drupal add CSS or Drupal add JS functions anymore. Everything is done through the libraries.yaml file and attached in some way. Just more water. So let's just quickly look at the implementation of this on the previous Next website. So I originally did this on a client site, which is what the blog post came out of, but I really needed to have more control to experiment and try out new things, so being able to work on the previous Next site was just the easiest way, really. I could break it and no one really got angry at me. So just how do you test this stuff, really? I mean, it's not a foolproof way, but I just found it really easy to go use these sort of things. So just quickly, Chrome DevTools, the network tab, the performance tab, and the coverage tabs are detailed in these links, but they're really useful for just seeing a really quick sort of feedback of what my change has created. Reviewing the amount of files, how many aggregate files, whether they're different between different pages, etc. And the network tab can also tell you if HTTP2 is being used on your site. So if you don't know how to check it, you can just Google how to check HTTP2 in the network tab in Chrome. And the coverage tab is really great for seeing how much of the CSS is used or not used at JavaScript as well. So it'll show you, it'll give you like overall stats, but it'll also show you within the file what is and isn't being used, which is really useful to see, especially once you've aggregated, pre-processed a SAS file into a CSS. You can really break it down and see what's being used and not, and if you need to tweak how you're combining those things. I use webpagetest.org for a more overall test of the website once it's gone through to a environment that is available to test. And you can also, I like this one because you can do auth, so HTTP auth is available. You can just put in the details and it'll bypass that. Not all of the testing tools have that ability. And it gives you really, really detailed results of a test, so you can really get in and see what's happening, how fast it is, and why. So the baseline of the previous Next site had all of the assets loading on all of the pages. The CSS aggregate was the same on all of the pages because it was just one styles.css file from my theme. The JavaScript was changing based on different modules. Like I said, the responsive image module, responsive tables modules were causing that aggregate file to be rebuilt on different pages. But generally, there was never more than 2 HTTP requests, one for the CSS, one for the JavaScript. And the combined asset size was 138 to 195 based on that different JavaScript file. Stage 2 was me refactoring the SAS and the libraries to be broken out into separate files for each of the sort of theme components and stuff. And attaching those libraries conditionally, so going through the twig templates or pre-processing those libraries into the places where they were needed to be loaded. But Drupal was still aggregating that all into 2 files. So I wasn't yet setting pre-process false on those libraries, conditional libraries. So really there was no improvement with this. I mean, the size of the assets that were on the page were a bit smaller because not everything was being added that wasn't needed. But the improvements that you get out of that are lost by the fact that the aggregate file is being reloaded on different pages, and that's slowing things back down again. The Advanced Aggregation Bundler module is a good way to get around that. It sort of breaks, it'll break an aggregate out into smaller chunks. So instead of being one CSS and one aggregate file, you have more control over how that gets broken out into smaller chunks so that it's less likely to be rebuilt on all of the different pages. So that's definitely worth looking into if you're going to try and do this. Stage 3 was setting those conditional libraries to have that pre-processed false flag so that they weren't even being aggregated at all. It meant a lot more HTTP requests, but it also meant I could utilize things like the defer and async attributes for my JavaScript files, so improve the performance with that. There were sort of between 2 and 9 HTTP requests, so a basic page only had no conditional assets being loaded onto it. It was all of the global stuff, so it only had 2 files. But the blog post had 9 HTTP requests because it had the most complex stuff on it. The size of file ranged from 120 to 170, so a lot reasonably smaller, really. It's a very simple site, so the gains were less on this compared to the first site that I did this on. But it definitely needs to have HTTP2 enabled on your server to do this because of those extra HTTP requests. This article I read doing this research pointed out that you can't just add a whole heap of HTTP requests. Like, you have to have some rigor. There is a point where there's too much that will be a negative performance impact as well. So you really need to consider how many different assets you're adding, and how many different HTTP requests you're adding onto a site. This amount 9 was totally fine. And the results, so the blog post was 7% smaller. It was a really small difference, really, because it was the most complex page and it had most of the components on it anyway. They were all still being loaded, really. A basic page compared to the blog post had a 34% saving. So that's a more reasonable difference. But the blog post, the first byte was 27% faster. It started rendering 15% sooner, was visually complete 20% sooner. The overall load time of this wasn't much different, but the perceived performance of this sort of sooner rendering and sooner sort of seeing impacts was a big difference. There's still other things I need to improve on the previous next site, like optimizing images a bit better and all that sort of stuff, but that's sort of not related to the asset library system. And that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
So you said that this has changed quite a bit since your original blog post, and you're probably going to do a follow-up. What do you think? What is the main thing that has, changed in that time frame?
Well, my knowledge of there can be too many HTTP requests on a page, even if you have HTTP2. That's definitely not something I was aware of at the time. Yeah.
So are you advocating essentially anything that's conditional, you're probably going to want to remove that from the main aggregation as a rule? Is there any exceptions to that, like a size of certain files, or when it's conditional, maybe it's conditional half the time, and therefore there's some improvement?
Yeah, so there's, I mean, I looked at it as like there's a balance. You have like if it's on 90% of the pages, then you probably want it to be in your info file and loaded on every page anyway. But if it's on sort of, I don't know, 70 or 80% of the pages, then you might want to do it conditionally. But it's really just you have to test it. It depends on your own site and your own components. Yeah.
Two, if I may. First of all, if you do have an HTTP 1 client, is that going to be impacted by what you're talking about?
Yes, yeah.
And the other one, how does this interact with CDNs if you're wanting to escape the download altogether, but you're doing the aggregation?
Yeah, that's a good question and not something I've looked at. Yeah.
Did your research change the way you authored CSS or SCSS?
Only in the sense that, I mean, we always broke out our components into different SAS files when we were writing them, but we were compiling them all into one styles.css file. So that's the only approach that changed. We stopped compiling them into that one file and keeping them as separate things.
So, with modular CSS, like the way I've been authoring things, little bits seem to be used everywhere. So, little components of my modular system end up being part of the header and part of the footer. Like, that's what I mean, I guess. Did you sort of rethink the modules that you were writing?
Yeah, I did actually. So I made a lot more things mix-ins so that they could be shared between different components rather than relying on them being loaded at a certain point anyway. Yeah. No? Okay. Thanks, Jess.